Jake had never planned to speak, not because he lacked words, but because the story he carried had been sealed inside the family long before he was old enough to understand it. When he finally decided to talk, it wasn't driven by anger or a need for sympathy. It was driven by exhaustion. Years of watching his father be remembered for strength, humor, and resilience, while something fragile and unresolved remained hidden beneath that image. Jake understood that silence can protect, but it can also distort, and he had reached a point where distortion felt heavier than truth. He began by explaining that his father was not always the confident figure the public saw. Long before fame, long before success, there was an event that reshaped the emotional architecture of their family. It was never discussed openly. It was referenced indirectly, in sudden changes of mood, in topics carefully avoided, in the way Rob sometimes withdrew without explanation. As a child, Jake sensed it without understanding it. As an adult, he finally recognized its outline. The tragedy centered on a loss that predated Rob's public life, one that occurred when he was still forming his sense of self. It was not a dramatic scandal or a moment the world would have recognized. It was quieter, more personal, and precisely because of that, more enduring. Jake described it as a wound that never fully healed, only adapted, shaping how his father loved, worked, and protected those around him. Growing up, Jake noticed that his father was fiercely attentive but emotionally guarded. He showed up consistently, supported ambitions, and encouraged expression, yet there were boundaries he never crossed. Certain questions were redirected. Certain memories remained untouched. Jake learned early that curiosity had limits. Those limits were never enforced harshly. They were implied, reinforced by silence rather than refusal. As Jake matured, fragments began to align. Conversations overheard. Reactions that seemed disproportionate to minor events. A pattern of self-reliance that bordered on isolation. He realized his father had learned, early on, that depending too deeply could be dangerous. Loss had taught him to build walls that were invisible but effective. Those walls protected him, but they also separated him from full vulnerability. When Jake finally confronted his father gently, not with accusation but with concern, Rob did not deny the past. He acknowledged it briefly, carefully, as if naming it too clearly might give it power. He explained that some pain does not disappear when exposed. Sometimes it multiplies. He believed that by burying it, he was sparing his children from inheriting its weight. Jake understood the intention, but he also saw the cost. The tragedy, as Jake described it, was not defined by a single moment, but by its aftermath. It reshaped Rob's relationship with risk, with trust, with emotional dependence. It influenced his work ethic, his drive, his insistence on control in areas where chaos once ruled. Jake realized that what the world admired as discipline had grown partly from fear. Not fear of failure, but fear of repeating a loss that had never been processed. Jake admitted that learning this changed how he saw his father. It did not diminish him. It humanized him. The man he had admired became more complex, more fragile, and in that fragility, more understandable. He saw that Rob's humor had often been a buffer, his productivity a refuge, his composure a shield carefully maintained. Speaking now, Jake did not seek to rewrite his father's legacy. He sought to complete it. He believed that acknowledging buried pain does not weaken a life story. It deepens it. Rob Reiner was strong not because he was untouched by tragedy, but because he lived alongside it, shaping a life of meaning despite its presence. That Jake's revelation was not an act of exposure. It was an act of respect. He wanted people to know that his father's kindness, patience, and empathy were not accidental traits. They were responses to loss. They were choices made in defiance of pain rather than ignorance of it. By breaking the silence, Jake hoped to honor not just who his father appeared to be, but who he truly was beneath the surface. Jake explained that once the silence around his father's past was broken, even partially, it began to reframe moments he had never questioned before. There were nights when Rob worked late without explanation, mornings when he seemed distant despite being physically present, and family gatherings where laughter felt genuine yet carefully contained. These were not signs of detachment, Jake realized, but of a man constantly negotiating with memory. Rob had learned how to function at a high level while carrying something unresolved, and that skill became both his strength and his burden as a teenager. Jake had interpreted his father's restraint as discipline. He admired it, even tried to imitate it. He believed emotional control was a virtue, something that separated maturity from weakness. It was only later that he understood control can also be a survival strategy. Rob had learned early that emotion left unattended could spiral, and so he learned to manage it with precision. That precision served him well in his career, but it also created distance in moments where closeness required risk. Jake described how this dynamic shaped their relationship. There was affection, guidance, and support, but there was also an unspoken rule that pain should be handled privately. When Jake struggled, Rob listened carefully but offered solutions rather than shared vulnerability. He wanted to help without reopening doors he had worked hard to keep closed. Jake accepted this for years, believing it was simply his father's way. Only later did he recognize it as self-protection disguised as care. The tragedy itself, though never named in explicit detail, involved a loss that taught Rob how quickly stability could disappear. It happened at a formative age, before he had the tools to process it fully. The adults around him had encouraged him to move forward, to stay busy, to avoid dwelling. That advice, well-intentioned, taught him that survival required momentum. Grief was something to outrun, not explore. Rob took that lesson seriously, building a life defined by forward motion. Jake noted that this approach created a paradox. Rob was deeply empathetic, often sensing others' pain before they articulated it. Yet he struggled to articulate his own. He could sit with someone else's grief calmly, offering presence without intrusion, because he had practiced that restraint internally for decades. The cost was that his own loss remained unintegrated, influencing his behavior without being acknowledged. As Jake grew older, he felt the impact of this dynamic more acutely. He wanted to understand his father not just as a provider or mentor, but as a person shaped by history. When he finally asked directly, Rob's response was measured. He did not dismiss the past, but he did not dwell on it either. He explained that some wounds do not benefit from exposure, that revisiting them can reopen pain without offering resolution. Jake respected that view, but he also sensed that the choice had been made in a different era, under different assumptions about emotional health. The conversation marked a turning point. Even without details, the acknowledgement changed the atmosphere between them. Jake felt closer to his father not because he knew everything, but because he knew enough to understand the silences. Those silences became less confusing, less personal. They were no longer barriers, but boundaries shaped by experience. That understanding allowed Jake to stop interpreting distance as rejection. Jake also reflected on how this buried tragedy influenced Rob's parenting. His father was intensely protective, sometimes to the point of anxiety. He worried about safety, about stability, about things going wrong without warning. At times, this caution felt excessive. But in light of what Jake had learned, it made sense. Rob had lived through a moment where the world changed abruptly, and he never fully trusted it not to happen again. Protection became his way of exerting control over uncertainty. Speaking now, Jake emphasized that his father never framed himself as a victim. He resisted that identity strongly. He believed in agency, in responsibility, in building rather than dwelling. That belief shaped his work ethic and his public persona, but also meant that parts of his story remained unfinished. Not because he lacked courage, but because he believed courage meant endurance rather than disclosure. Jake acknowledged the complexity of that belief. Endurance had allowed Rob to create a remarkable life, to offer stability to others, to contribute meaningfully to culture. But endurance alone had limits. It required constant energy. It demanded suppression. Over time, it created fatigue that was difficult to name. Jake saw this fatigue in later years, in moments when his father seemed weary despite continued success. By choosing to speak now, Jake was not criticizing his father's choices. He was contextualizing them. He wanted people to understand that Rob's resilience was not innate. It was constructed, shaped by loss, and maintained through effort, recognizing that did not weaken the image of his father. It added depth. It allowed admiration to coexist with compassion. Jake ended this part of his reflection by explaining that families often carry unspoken histories that shape behavior across generations. Silence can protect children, but it can also leave them interpreting patterns without context. By sharing what he could, Jake hoped to interrupt that cycle, not by exposing everything, but by acknowledging that something had existed and that it had mattered. In doing so, he believed he was honoring his father's humanity, not diminishing it. Jake said that once he understood the origin of his father's guardedness, he began to see how it echoed through the entire family system. It was not just Rob who learned to compartmentalize pain. Everyone around him adapted to that rhythm. Emotions were respected, but they were also contained. Difficult conversations were handled carefully, often indirectly. The family functioned well, but always with an unspoken awareness that some doors remained closed for a reason. As a young adult, Jake struggled with this dynamic more than he admitted at the time. He wanted openness. He wanted emotional exchange that felt mutual rather than instructional. When he faced setbacks or disappointment, he sometimes felt that his father responded with solutions instead of shared vulnerability. Rob offered guidance generously, but he rarely said, "I went through this too." Jake now understood that this omission was not dismissive. It was protective. His father believed that revisiting his own pain would not help his children. He thought strength meant shielding them from what he had endured. Jake reflected on how this belief influenced Rob's relationships beyond the family. Friends often described Rob as supportive and present, yet emotionally self-contained. He listened more than he spoke about himself. He offered insight without oversharing. People trusted him deeply, even if they did not know everything about him. Jake realized that this pattern made Rob a reliable anchor for others, but it also meant that his own needs were often processed in isolation. The tragedy that Rob buried was never allowed to define him publicly, but it shaped his internal compass. It informed his intolerance for chaos, his respect for routine, and his insistence on preparation. Jake remembered how his father reacted strongly to unexpected disruptions, even minor ones. At the time, it seemed disproportionate. In retrospect, it felt logical. Rob had learned that life could change irreversibly in a single moment. Predictability became a form of safety. Jake described a period in his 20s when he and his father clashed over this very issue. Jake wanted to take risks, to move more freely, to trust that things would work out. Rob cautioned restraint, preparation, backup plans. Their disagreements were not explosive, but they were persistent. Each believed they were protecting the other. Only later did Jake realize that Rob's caution was rooted not in doubt about his son, but in fear shaped by memory. When Jake finally connected these dots, it softened his frustration. He stopped interpreting his father's caution as control and began seeing it as concern amplified by experience. This shift changed how they communicated. Jake became more patient with Rob's warnings, and Rob, sensing that his son was listening differently, allowed himself to loosen his grip slightly. Their relationship did not transform overnight, but it evolved. Jake also spoke about the cost of burying pain across decades. He noticed that his father rarely allowed himself to rest fully. Even in moments of success, there was an undercurrent of vigilance. Rob celebrated achievements, but he did not linger in them. He moved quickly to the next project, the next goal. Jake saw now that this momentum was not driven solely by ambition. It was driven by a belief that stopping might allow something painful to resurface. As Rob aged, Jake noticed small changes. Moments of reflection became more frequent. The pace slowed slightly. There were hints that the past was closer to the surface, even if still unnamed. Jake wondered whether his father was reconsidering his long-held belief that silence was the safest option. They never had a full conversation about it, but Jake sensed a quiet acknowledgement between them, a mutual understanding that some things, even if unspoken, were shared. Jake emphasized that his decision to speak now was influenced by this awareness. He felt that his father had carried the weight long enough. Sharing its existence, even without details, felt like a release rather than a betrayal. He believed that acknowledging buried pain did not dishonor resilience. It contextualized it. It allowed people to see that strength often grows out of survival, not immunity. He also acknowledged his own hesitation. Speaking about family history invites scrutiny, interpretation, and misunderstanding. Jake worried about simplifying a complex story or reducing his father to a single narrative of loss. That was never his intention. He wanted to add dimension, not redefine. He trusted that people could hold complexity if given the chance. Jake concluded this section by reflecting on what silence teaches across generations. Silence can protect, but it can also leave children inheriting patterns without understanding their origin. By breaking part of that silence, Jake hoped to offer clarity rather than closure. He did not believe every story needed to be fully told to be honored. Some truths, he said, only need to be acknowledged to loosen their grip. In revealing that his father had lived with a buried tragedy, Jake was not asking the world to reinterpret Rob Reiner's life. He was inviting it to see the man behind the composure, to recognize that the empathy, discipline, and restraint so many admired were forged through experience rather than ease. That recognition, Jake believed, did not diminish his father's legacy. It deepened it, allowing admiration to coexist with understanding and respect to coexist with compassion. Jake went on to explain that understanding his father's buried tragedy also changed how he viewed the public image that surrounded Rob for decades. To the world, Rob Reiner appeared steady, confident, and almost immune to self-doubt. He spoke with clarity, made decisions decisively, and rarely appeared shaken. Jake now understood that this image was not the absence of vulnerability, but the result of intense discipline. His father had learned how to function without letting pain interrupt momentum, and over time, that ability became indistinguishable from strength in private. However, Jake had occasionally seen the cracks. They appeared in fleeting moments, never announced, never lingered on. A sudden silence in the middle of a conversation. A distant look when a particular subject surfaced unexpectedly. A change in tone that passed as quickly as it arrived. As a child, Jake assumed these moments were unrelated to him. As an adult, he realized they were echoes. The past was never gone. It was simply managed. Jake described how Rob's creative drive was also shaped by this unresolved loss. Work became a place where control was possible. Stories had structure. Characters faced conflict and found resolution. Endings could be written, revised, perfected. Life, by contrast, had once delivered an ending Rob could not rewrite. Jake believed this was why his father was drawn to storytelling. It allowed him to impose meaning where chaos had once ruled. This perspective changed how Jake viewed his father's perfectionism. What once felt like high standards now looked like emotional scaffolding. Rob needed order not because he was rigid, but because disorder carried memories he did not want to revisit. Preparation was not obsession. It was protection. Jake said that recognizing this shifted his own patience. He stopped pushing against those tendencies and began working around them, respecting their origin even when they frustrated him. Jake also spoke about how the buried tragedy influenced the way Rob expressed love. His father loved deeply but cautiously. He gave generously, but always with an eye towards safety. He encouraged independence early, not because he wanted distance, but because he feared dependency could magnify loss. Jake realized that this approach had given him resilience, but it had also created moments of emotional distance that were difficult to name at the time. As Jake matured, he found himself repeating some of these patterns unconsciously. He noticed his own tendency to stay busy during difficult periods, to solve rather than sit, to move forward rather than reflect. Recognizing this inheritance was unsettling. It forced him to confront the reality that unspoken pain does not disappear. It migrates. It reshapes behavior across generations unless it is acknowledged. This realization became one of the reasons Jake chose to speak. He did not want to continue the pattern of silence without awareness. He believed that understanding the origin of certain behaviors offered choice. Without context, patterns feel inevitable. With context, they become optional. Jake wanted to give himself and others that option. He was careful, however, not to frame his father's silence as failure. Rob had made the best choices he could with the tools and cultural expectations available to him at the time. Emotional restraint had been encouraged, even rewarded. Vulnerability, especially from men of his generation, was often equated with weakness. Rob had navigated those expectations successfully, building a life of accomplishment and stability. Jake respected that deeply. At the same time, Jake believed that times had changed. What once felt protective could now be limiting. Speaking about the existence of buried pain did not dishonor the past. It reflected growth. It acknowledged that resilience can coexist with reflection and that strength does not require silence to survive. Jake shared that after his father's passing, he revisited many conversations in his memory. Words that once felt casual now carried weight. Advice that once seemed practical now revealed emotional subtext. He realized that Rob had been speaking around his pain for years, offering lessons shaped by experience he never fully named. Those lessons had guided Jake more than he realized at the time. One such lesson was about responsibility. Rob believed deeply in showing up, regardless of internal struggle. He did not allow pain to excuse absence. Jake admired that ethic, but he also saw its cost. Showing up consistently required suppressing parts of oneself. Over decades, that suppression demanded energy. Jake believed his father had grown tired in ways few people recognized. That be why sharing this now. Jake hoped to allow a more complete understanding of his father's life. Not as a contradiction, but as a composition. Joy and sorrow existed side by side. Success did not erase loss. Discipline did not eliminate vulnerability. Rob Reiner was not defined by the tragedy he buried, but shaped the way he lived, loved, and led. Jake ended this section of his reflection by acknowledging that truth does not always need full exposure to be healing. Sometimes simply naming that something existed is enough. He did not intend to uncover every detail or satisfy curiosity. His goal was not revelation for its own sake. It was recognition. Recognizing that his father's strength had been forged through survival, not ease. Recognizing that silence had been a strategy, not an absence. And recognizing that by gently lifting the weight of that silence, even partially, he was honoring his father's full humanity. In doing so, Jake believed he was not reopening old wounds, but allowing them to breathe, ensuring that what had shaped his father for decades no longer needed to remain invisible to be understood. Jake said that once he allowed himself to speak openly about his father's buried pain, he began noticing how many people quietly related to the story. They did not ask for details. They did not press for names or dates. Instead, they responded with recognition. They spoke about their own families, about things that were never discussed but always felt. Jake realized that what he was describing was not unusual. It was familiar. Many families carry invisible histories that shape behavior long after the original event fades from conversation. This realization reframed how Jake thought about legacy. Legacy was not just what his father created or achieved. It was also what he modeled emotionally, intentionally or not. Rob had shown his children how to endure, how to function under pressure, how to remain reliable, even when carrying something heavy. These lessons were valuable. But Jake also saw that endurance without reflection can become inheritance. Patterns repeat not because they are chosen, but because they are unexamined. Jake described a moment shortly after his father's passing when he felt an unexpected sense of responsibility. Not to protect Rob's image, but to protect the truth of his complexity. He worried that without context, people might romanticize his father's composure or misinterpret his restraint as emotional simplicity. Jake believed that doing so would flatten a life that was anything but simple, that he spoke about the temptation to mythologize strength. Society often celebrates those who appear unaffected, who keep moving without pause. But Jake had learned that this image can obscure the labor required to maintain it. His father's steadiness was not effortless. It was maintained daily through discipline, distraction, and a careful avoidance of certain memories. Recognizing this did not make Rob less admirable. It made him more so. Jake also reflected on how his father's silence influenced conflict within the family. Difficult topics were approached cautiously, sometimes indirectly. Tension existed, but it was rarely explosive. Instead, it settled into routines, into habits of avoidance that kept things functional but unresolved. Jake admitted that this approach had spared them from chaos, but it had also delayed understanding. As an adult, Jake found himself repeating these strategies in his own relationships. When conflict arose, he leaned toward resolution rather than exploration. He fixed problems efficiently, but he sometimes skipped the emotional processing that gives resolution depth. Recognizing this pattern was uncomfortable. It forced him to confront the possibility that what he had admired as maturity might also be a form of emotional economy learned early. This awareness prompted Jake to change how he engaged with others. He began asking different questions, allowing conversations to slow rather than steering them toward solutions. He practiced sitting with discomfort without immediately trying to manage it. These changes were subtle, but they felt significant. They represented a departure from inherited habits, not in rejection of his father's example, but an expansion of it. Jake emphasized that none of this meant his father had lived incorrectly. Rob had lived according to the tools and values available to him. Emotional restraint had been framed as responsibility, particularly for men in his generation. Jake believed his father had done the best he could within that framework. The goal now was not to judge the past, but to build on it with greater awareness. He also spoke about forgiveness, though not in the traditional sense. There was nothing to forgive. There was no wrongdoing. Instead, Jake described a process of releasing expectations he had once held. Expectations that his father would eventually explain everything. Expectations that closure would arrive through conversation. Letting go of those expectations allowed Jake to appreciate what had been offered instead. Consistency, presence, commitment. Jake acknowledged that some people might question why he chose to speak at all if he was not going to reveal specifics. His answer was simple. He was not telling a story to satisfy curiosity. He was naming a reality to challenge assumptions. The assumption that strength means immunity. The assumption that silence means absence. The assumption that success erases pain. Jake wanted to disrupt those ideas gently, without spectacle. He also believed that by acknowledging the existence of buried tragedy, he was honoring the full scope of his father's life. Rob Reiner had not been defined by one loss, but that loss had influenced his choices. Ignoring it would erase part of his humanity. Acknowledging it allowed for a more honest appreciation of his achievements and relationships. Jake spoke quietly about what he wished people would take from his words. Not sympathy for his father, not curiosity about details, but permission. Permission to question inherited patterns. Permission to acknowledge unspoken histories. Permission to understand that resilience and vulnerability are not opposites. They are often partners. As he reflected on his father's life, Jake felt a sense of peace that surprised him. Speaking did not feel like exposure. It felt like alignment. He was no longer holding two separate images of his father, one public and one private. They had begun to merge into a single, more truthful understanding. That integration felt like a form of closure he had not realized he was seeking. Jake concluded this part of his reflection by saying that some stories do not need to be fully told to be complete. Some only need to be recognized as part of the landscape. His father's buried tragedy was one of those stories. It had shaped a life of meaning, discipline, and care. By acknowledging its presence, Jake believed he was allowing that life to be seen not as flawless, but as deeply, authentically human. Jake said that after sharing his father's story, even in such a restrained way, he began to feel a subtle shift in how he carried his own memories. They no longer felt fragmented. For years, there had been a quiet tension between what he admired about his father and what he struggled to understand. Speaking allowed those two perspectives to coexist without conflict. His father could be both strong and shaped by loss, disciplined and vulnerable. protective and limited by that same protection. Holding all of that at once felt more honest than choosing one version over the other, that he noticed that this honesty changed how he remembered everyday moments. Small interactions that once seemed neutral now carried emotional texture. His father's insistence on routine, his aversion to unpredictability, his calm responses during crises. These traits were no longer abstract characteristics. They were adaptive responses. Understanding that gave Jake a new kind of compassion, one that did not require explanation or justification. Jake also spoke about the fear that often surrounds breaking family silence. There's a belief that naming buried pain will somehow undo what has been built on top of it, that it will destabilize relationships, tarnish reputations, or invite misunderstanding. Jake had felt that fear intensely. He worried that even acknowledging the existence of tragedy might feel like betrayal. What he found instead was relief. Not because everything was resolved, but because the weight of secrecy had been shared. He described how secrecy functions in families as both shelter and pressure. It keeps things contained, but it also concentrates force. Over time, that force pushes outward in subtle ways. Through anxiety, through control, through avoidance. Jake realized that his father's silence had not eliminated pain. It had redistributed it across habits and expectations. Recognizing this allowed Jake to stop searching for a single moment where things went wrong. Nothing had gone wrong. Something had simply happened, and it had never been integrated. Jake reflected on how this understanding influenced his sense of responsibility as a son. For years, he had felt an unspoken obligation to uphold his father's composure, to mirror his restraint, to avoid asking questions that might disrupt stability. Now he felt permission to redefine that responsibility. Honoring his father did not mean repeating his coping strategies. It meant understanding them and choosing consciously which to carry forward. He admitted that this process was ongoing. Patterns ingrained over decades do not dissolve with insight alone. There were moments when he still defaulted to productivity during emotional discomfort, when he still avoided vulnerability out of habit. The difference now was awareness. He could notice the impulse and decide whether to follow it. That choice felt like a gift, one he wanted to pass on rather than keep private. Jake also addressed the public response to his words. Some people expressed disappointment that he had not revealed specifics. Others speculated, filling gaps with their own narratives. Jake remained unfazed by this. He understood the nature of curiosity, but he did not feel obligated to satisfy it. His purpose was not disclosure. It was reframing. He wanted people to understand that lives are shaped by experiences that may never be fully articulated, and that this does not make them incomplete. He believed that by resisting the urge to explain everything, he was modeling a different kind of honesty, one that respects boundaries while still acknowledging truth, one that allows complexity without forcing resolution. This approach felt aligned with his father's values, even if it departed from his methods. Rob had believed in protecting others from pain. Jake believed in equipping them to understand it. Jake spoke about grief as a process that evolves over time. In the immediate aftermath of loss, there's often a scramble to make sense of what remains. Memories surface unevenly. Questions feel urgent. Over time, the urgency softens, replaced by a quieter need for coherence. Speaking now felt like part of that process. It was not about the past alone. It was about how the past continued to live in the present. That he also acknowledged that not all family members experienced this journey the same way. Each had their own relationship with their father, their own interpretation of silence, their own threshold for disclosure. Jake did not claim to speak for anyone else. His perspective was personal, shaped by his own position and experiences. He believed that allowing multiple truths to exist was another way of honoring complexity. Jake described a moment of unexpected clarity when he realized that his father's buried tragedy had not only shaped what Rob avoided, but also what he valued deeply. Loyalty, consistency, responsibility. These values were not abstract ideals. They were defenses against loss. By committing to them, Rob created a life that felt stable and meaningful, even if it required personal sacrifice. Recognizing this allowed Jake to feel gratitude without idealization. He could appreciate what his father had given without pretending it came without cost. He could mourn what was never shared without resenting what was. This balance felt healthier than the extremes he had oscillated between before. Neither blind admiration nor quiet frustration, just understanding. Jake concluded this section by reflecting on the nature of inheritance. What we inherit is not only material or genetic, it is emotional, behavioral, philosophical. Some of it serves us, some of it constrains us. The task, he believed, was not to reject inheritance outright, but to examine it, to decide what to keep, what to modify, and what to release. By speaking about his father's buried tragedy, Jake felt he had taken a step toward that examination. He had not solved anything. He had not closed a chapter, but he had opened a space where understanding could grow. That space, he believed, was a fitting continuation of his father's life. A life defined not by the absence of pain, but by the choices made in its presence. Jake said that as his understanding deepened, he began to reconsider what healing actually meant in the context of his family. For a long time, he had assumed healing required disclosure, conversation, and resolution. He believed that unspoken things needed to be spoken aloud to lose their power. What he came to realize was more nuanced. Healing, for his father, had taken the form of construction rather than excavation. Rob had built a life so full, so structured, and so purposeful that the buried pain no longer dictated his direction, even if it still influenced his pace. Jake acknowledged that this approach had worked in many ways. His father's life was not diminished by what he carried. It was expansive. He created work that mattered, maintained relationships that endured, and offered stability to those around him. The tragedy did not hollow him out. It shaped him. Understanding that allowed Jake to release any lingering sense that something essential had been missing. Something had been withheld, yes, but not out of neglect. Out of strategy. He described how this reframing changed the way he remembered his childhood. Moments that once felt emotionally distant now felt intentional. Rob had not been withholding affection. He had been rationing exposure. He wanted his children to feel safe, not burdened. He wanted them to grow without inheriting fear. Jake could now see that his father had succeeded in many respects. Jake had grown up believing the world was manageable, that problems could be addressed, that consistency mattered. Those beliefs had served him well at the same time. Jake admitted that safety achieved through silence carries its own trade-offs. It can limit emotional vocabulary. It can delay self-awareness. It can create confusion when patterns repeat without explanation. Recognizing this did not turn gratitude into resentment. It added context. It allowed Jake to appreciate the protection while also acknowledging the cost. Jake spoke about how this insight influenced his own parenting decisions. He became more conscious of when he chose reassurance over honesty, when he opted for calm rather than curiosity. He did not want to overcorrect, turning vulnerability into obligation. He wanted balance. He wanted to model openness without transferring weight. This required ongoing attention, not a fixed rule book. He felt that this attentiveness was one of the most meaningful ways he could honor his father's legacy. He also reflected on the role of time in understanding family narratives. Certain truths do not become visible until enough distance exists. When emotions are too close, perspective is limited. Jake believed that if he had learned about his father's buried tragedy earlier, he might not have understood it. He might have interpreted it through the lens of youth, assigning blame or urgency where none belonged. Learning it gradually, indirectly, had allowed for maturity rather than reaction. Jake emphasized that this gradual awareness mirrored his father's own pace. Rob had never rushed emotional processes. He believed in readiness. He believed that timing mattered. Jake felt that his decision to speak now was aligned with that belief. It was not premature. It was not delayed. It felt appropriate to who he had become and to the moment he found himself in. He also addressed the discomfort some people expressed about ambiguity. They wanted clarity, definition, answers. Jake understood that desire. He had felt it himself. What he learned was that clarity does not always arrive through detail. Sometimes it arrives through acceptance. Accepting that some stories remain incomplete does not weaken understanding. It deepens it by allowing space for interpretation rather than forcing conclusion. Jake shared that since speaking, he felt less pressure to protect a specific image of his father. That image had never been fragile, but Jake had treated it as such for years. Letting go of that vigilance felt liberating. It allowed him to remember Rob in a more relaxed way, without editing memories to fit an ideal. His father could be thoughtful and rigid, loving and guarded, confident and cautious. All of it could exist without contradiction. That he also spoke about how this process reshaped his own relationship with silence. Silence no longer felt like something to either maintain or break. It became something to evaluate. Sometimes silence was appropriate. Sometimes it was avoided. Learning to distinguish between the two became an ongoing practice. Jake believed that this discernment, rather than disclosure itself, was the real inheritance his father had passed down. Jake described a quiet moment when this realization settled fully. He was alone, reflecting on a conversation he wished he could have had with his father. Instead of feeling regret, he felt understanding. He realized that even without that conversation, much had been communicated. Through actions, through consistency, through presence. Words would not have replaced those things. They might have clarified, but they would not have transformed what already existed. He acknowledged that grief often creates an urge to revisit the past with a sense of urgency, to extract meaning before it slips away. Over time, that urgency softens. Meaning becomes less about answers and more about integration. Jake felt he had reached that stage. He was no longer searching for what had been missing. He was recognizing what had been there all along, even if it had taken a different form. Jake concluded this section by saying that his father's buried tragedy did not define him, but it did explain him. It explained the care, the caution, the discipline, and the deep respect for responsibility. It explained why Rob Reiner lived the way he did, loved the way he did, and protected the way he did. Understanding this allowed Jake to carry his father's memory forward without distortion, that he believed that this understanding was not an endpoint, but a foundation. It would continue to inform how he navigated his own life, how he related to others, and how he approached moments of uncertainty. In that sense, his father's influence had not ended. It had evolved. The tragedy that Rob buried for decades no longer needed to remain hidden to be honored. It could exist quietly in the background, acknowledged and integrated, shaping the future without overshadowing it. Jake said that with time, the story he chose to tell stopped feeling like something he was carrying alone. It began to feel shared, not because others knew details, but because they understood the pattern. He noticed that conversations shifted when people recognized themselves in the outline of his father's life. They spoke about parents who never explained certain behaviors, about grandparents whose silence shaped entire households, about strengths that seemed admirable but exhausting. Jake realized that what resonated was not the tragedy itself, but the way it was managed. He reflected on how society often rewards people who appear unaffected. Those who keep moving, who stay productive, who maintain composure are praised as resilient. Rarely do we ask what it costs to sustain that image. Jake believed his father had paid that cost quietly, not in a way that diminished his life, but in a way that demanded constant vigilance. Understanding this allowed Jake to feel pride without illusion. Jake spoke about memory and how it changes when context is added. Certain memories grew softer, others sharper. His father's seriousness during moments that seemed small now felt purposeful. His reluctance to linger in sadness felt intentional rather than dismissive. Jake no longer wished those moments had been different. He simply wished he had understood them sooner. That he also addressed the idea of burden. Many people fear that sharing pain will burden others. Jake believed his father had internalized that fear deeply. Rob did not want his children to carry what he carried. In doing so, he absorbed it himself. Jake honored that choice, even as he recognized its limitations. He believed that protection and connection exist in tension, and navigating that tension requires constant recalibration. Jake described how this insight reshaped his understanding of love. Love was not only expressed through openness, it was expressed through consistency, through showing up, through creating stability. His father had loved through action rather than confession. Jake realized that he had benefited from that love even when he longed for different expressions of it. As Jake spoke, he emphasized that there was no villain in this story, no mistake that needed correction. There was only a man responding to loss with the tools available to him. That response had shaped a life of purpose and contribution. Jake believed that acknowledging the origin of those tools did not weaken them. It made them more transparent. He also reflected on the timing of grief. Grief does not unfold linearly. It revisits old moments with new understanding. Jake felt that his current reflections were part of that process. He was not revising history. He was reinterpreting it through the lens of maturity. This reinterpretation did not replace earlier feelings. It layered them. Jake acknowledged that some listeners might still want answers. They might want to know what happened, when, and why. He understood that impulse, but he believed that some truths function better as frameworks than facts. The framework he offered was simple. Pain existed. It was managed through silence. That management shaped a life. Knowing this was enough to understand the man, he spoke about gratitude, not as a requirement, but as a natural outcome of understanding. Gratitude for the stability his father provided. Gratitude for the discipline he modeled. Gratitude for the space he created for his children to grow without fear. These things mattered. They were not diminished by what remained unspoken. Jake also spoke about choice. The choice to continue silence or transform it. He believed that transformation did not require exposure. It required awareness. By becoming aware of the origin of certain patterns, he felt freer to choose differently. That freedom felt like the most meaningful inheritance his father had left him, but he reflected on the quiet courage it takes to live with unresolved pain. It is easier to dramatize suffering or to deny it altogether. Living alongside it requires discipline, restraint, and endurance. Jake believed his father had embodied that courage, even if it went unnoticed. Speaking now was his way of making that courage visible without spectacle. Jake described how this understanding changed the way he approached future challenges. He no longer measured strength by speed of recovery or clarity of emotion. He measured it by honesty, patience, and adaptability. These were qualities his father had demonstrated repeatedly. Even if he never labeled them as such as he looked forward, Jake felt less urgency to define his father's story. He felt content allowing it to remain complex. Some parts illuminated, some parts shadowed. Together, they formed a life that was real, not curated. That reality felt more respectful than any simplified narrative. Jake concluded this section by saying that breaking silence does not always mean speaking loudly. Sometimes it means acknowledging quietly. He believed he had done that. He had acknowledged the existence of something that shaped his father without allowing it to overshadow everything else. In doing so, he felt closer to his father than ever before. The tragedy robbed Reiner for decades no longer needed to remain hidden to maintain its power. It could be recognized, integrated, and carried forward with understanding rather than weight. Jake believed that this recognition honored his father's life not by rewriting it, but by finally seeing it whole. Jake said that arriving at this point in his understanding felt less like an ending and more like a quiet settling. The urgency that once accompanied questions about his father's past had softened into something steadier. He no longer felt compelled to resolve what had never been articulated. Instead, he focused on how that history continued to inform the present, shaping choices, reactions, and values in ways that were subtle but persistent. He reflected on how easily people assume that silence equals avoidance. In his father's case, silence had been an active decision, reinforced daily. Rob had chosen to live forward rather than inward, to invest energy in building rather than revisiting. Jake recognized that this approach had allowed his father to contribute meaningfully to others, even when it required personal restraint. That trade-off was not something Jake judged. It was something he now understood. Jake spoke about the relief that came with letting go of the idea that every life story must be fully explained to be honored. His father's life had been rich, impactful, and deeply relational. It did not need additional context to justify its value. Context simply allowed for empathy. It allowed people to see that the steadiness they admired was earned, not inherited. That he acknowledged that some listeners might still struggle with the lack of specifics. Curiosity often seeks detail as proof of authenticity. Jake believed authenticity could also exist without disclosure. He trusted that those who needed detail were not his audience. His intention was to speak to those who recognized the pattern, who felt seen by the shape of the story rather than its contents. Jake described how this recognition affected his grief. It no longer felt like something to work through or move past. It felt like something to live alongside. Grief became less about loss and more about continuity. His father's influence remained active, not through memory alone, but through habits of thought and response that Jake now noticed with greater clarity. He also reflected on how speaking had changed his relationship with responsibility. For years, he had felt responsible for maintaining the family's emotional equilibrium, for avoiding questions that might destabilize it. Now, responsibility felt different. It meant honoring truth without forcing it, allowing complexity without demanding resolution. That shift felt lighter, more sustainable. Jake spoke about the importance of compassion in this process. Compassion for his father, for himself, and for others navigating similar silences. He believed compassion begins when assumptions are questioned, when behavior is viewed through the lens of experience rather than judgment. Understanding his father's buried tragedy had expanded Jake's capacity for that kind of compassion. He also acknowledged the limits of understanding. There were aspects of his father's experience he would never fully grasp. That reality no longer frustrated him. It grounded him. It reminded him that intimacy does not require total access. It requires respect. Jake felt that respect more strongly now than ever before. Jake described a sense of alignment that came from integrating these insights. His father's life no longer felt divided between public success and private restraint. It felt cohesive. Each part informed the other. The discipline that produced stability also protected vulnerability. The silence that limited expression also preserved function. Seeing these connections allowed Jake to hold his father's story with less tension, but he spoke briefly about the future, not in terms of plans, but in terms of orientation. He wanted to move forward with awareness rather than repetition, to recognize inherited patterns and choose intentionally which to continue. That choice felt empowering. It transformed inheritance from destiny into resource. Jake emphasized that his decision to speak was not meant to set precedent. He did not believe everyone should break silence. He believed everyone should understand it. Silence, like speech, has purpose. The challenge is knowing when it serves growth and when it preserves stagnation. That discernment, he believed, was the real work. He concluded by returning to his father's legacy. Rob Reiner had lived a life defined by contribution, care, and commitment. The tragedy he buried for decades did not undermine those qualities. It explained their intensity. Acknowledging that explanation did not change the past. It changed the lens through which it was viewed. Jake said that seeing his father clearly, without myth or reduction, felt like the most honest tribute he could offer. Not by exposing everything, but by recognizing what had always been there. In doing so, he felt a sense of completion that did not rely on answers, only on understanding.